as a human rights investigator, trying to collect testimony from victims and eyewitnesses to violence. You're asking people to recount the worst moments of their lives. And I'd often do that over a meal.
Welcome to episode 86 of the LoraineCounty.com Insights Podcast. I'm your host, Ed Skimmon. I'd like to kick things off by thanking the LoraineCounty.com champion sponsors, Lorain County Community College, WOBL Radio, Lorain County Commissioners, Lorain County JVS, Emerge Inc., and Community Foundation of Lorain County. Today, we're talking with Michael Shaikh, author of the book, The Last Sweet Bite, Stories and Recipes of Culinary Heritage Lost and Found. Join us as Michael talks about his journey from Northeast Ohio to documenting human rights abuses in conflict zones around the world, including Afghanistan and Myanmar. He shares how his multicultural background and family shaped his passion for preserving culinary traditions amid violence. Michael discusses how collecting recipes became an act of defiance and reflects on the personal and professional challenges of his work. I had the chance to interview Michael while he was in town speaking to the students at Lake Ridge Academy in North Ridgeville, where he graduated in 1995. It is inspiring to see someone from our area make an impact on a global level. I also appreciate his willingness to return and share his insights with the next generation. I highly recommend reading his book, The Last Sweet Bite. Through vivid storytelling and striking imagery, Michael brings to life the people, places, and traditions that reveal how food connects us, even in times of loss and conflict. Here is my conversation with Michael Shaikh.
My name is Michael Shaikh, and I am the author of The Last Sweet Bite.
Thank you, Michael, for joining us and sharing your insights. Before we talk about your new book, I'd like to step back and talk about your journey. You grew up here in Northeast Ohio and went on to document human rights abuses in places like Afghanistan and Myanmar. Could you walk us through some of the highlights of your career and what experiences have shaped your perspective the most?
Growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, really kind of shaped a lot of who I am today. My parents, my father's from Pakistan and my mother's of Eastern European, Central European heritage. And I had a very international background because of that. We traveled to Pakistan a lot. My mother was, for lack of a better description, she was a feminist. And so I think that international background, that approach to equality, my parents were both in the medical and public health fields. So there was this element of giving back and doing right by your neighbors. And that was infused into my brother and sister and I. And coming to Lake Ridge was a place where a lot of those kind of values were here already and kind of helped me grow into that a bit. After that, I went off to college, and then I spent a part of my final year of college and then a couple years afterwards in Japan and studying Japanese, but also teaching English. And it propelled me into my human rights career in some measure. I had this really interesting moment in Japan where I was learning how to cook. This woman named Keiko, who I mentioned in the book, was teaching me how to cook her family's cuisine. And here I was learning this recipe in her language, her whole family's recipe, and I couldn't do that in mine, my father's language, my mother's language. And I went home after that experience back to the United States and talked to my father a bit about why I hadn't learned Sindhi, his language in Pakistan. And during those conversations, he started talking to me a bit about what he had seen and experienced in the partition of India and Pakistan and how it was one of the most violent episodes in kind of contemporary history. Hundreds, millions of people were displaced, millions were killed. And my father was a teenager when that happened and had witnessed some of that. And it had sat with him for a very long time. It was very painful for him to transmit parts of his culture to my brother and sister and I. And it made me start thinking about how violence lingers long after a war is over and violence is over, and how it can reach down through the generation and steal things from you. And it made me think about what it was taking from other people and in other cultures and communities across the world. And it kind of led me to the world of human rights, if you will.
You've traveled a very unconventional career path.
Yeah.
What kept you motivated, especially when things were difficult? And from reading your book, it sounds like it could have been dangerous at times.
Just a bit about kind of the work that I did as a human rights investigator. My job was documenting violations of international humanitarian law. So human rights that take place in the international context or in times of war. That was my focus. I did a lot of investigations into civilian harm in Afghanistan caused by both the Taliban and NATO and US forces. I looked at drone strikes in Pakistan. I did some work on how armed groups in Syria viewed human rights on the battlefield. And so a lot of it looked at human rights in the context of armed conflict. I also investigated the early phases of the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. And I can't think of a time that it wasn't difficult. All of these conflicts are really painful for a lot of people. And it's very difficult as a human rights investigator trying to collect testimony from victims and eyewitnesses to violence. And you're asking people to recount the worst moments of their lives sometimes. And I'd often do that over a meal as a way to break up the conversation. It would give us something to focus on outside the violence for a moment. And one of the things that I saw was of this violence I was investigating, it was changing the music, it was changing the art, it was changing the politics around us. But people started talking about the food that was in front of us and how it was disappearing. And they started talking about how these recipes that were being lost was almost like losing a family member. It was quite striking in these contexts. You're talking about actual human death and talking about cultural destruction at the same time. And the tone and the gravity in which they're talking about both were almost an equal weight in some ways. It was really quite powerful to me. And to your question about how did I take care of myself and others, I think some of these recipes that people gave to me as a way to take them out of that conflict zone so they would survive, I felt that it was a precious gift. And so I felt a responsibility to do right by them. That inspired me to continue to do other work like this book, but also I took care of myself by just having good community around me, making sure that my friends were watching out for me. I was watching out for them. My wife does similar work. She does a lot of work on human rights and public health. So I had a really good partner, both from a professional point of view, but also an emotional point of view. So like I was taken really care of, and I had really good bosses who watched out for me at the same time too.
We're recording today at Lake Ridge Academy in North Ridgeville, where you graduated in 1995. What do you remember about your time at Lake Ridge, and how did your time here impact your journey?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I was just talking to that with the entire school. One of the things that I really have taken away from Lake Ridge was the sense of community that I had here. When I was growing up in Cleveland and going to grade school, it was a tough time for me. I spent a lot of time trying to fit in, occasional little bit of bullying. And that energy of trying to fit in and just trying to get by affected me to the point that like my grades weren't so good. I had to take responsibility for some of it. Like I wasn't the greatest student, but I also spent a lot of time, a lot of energy trying to fit in, which didn't leave a lot of time on certain evenings of being exhausted, like to study. Coming to Lake Ridge, like right away, the community that was here, I saw people that looked like me. Being a half brown kid, half white kid here made it a lot easier. There were people whose families were from where I was from. There was an international dynamic that reflected my family a little bit. There was an openness to figuring out how a kid like me can learn differently. I wasn't great at learning from a book. I really was more of a hands-on learner, and Lake Ridge really leaned into that and saw that and allowed me to do really incredible things here. Allowed me to get outside of Ohio for a little bit. It was a really special place. And so I had to sit in the classroom, I had to learn from a book, but like at the same time, there was more opportunities to get outside and learn in a different way. So I take a lot of really interesting things away from Lake Ridge, but one is the community and the flexibility and allowing me to be curious.
Let's talk about your new book, The Last Sweet Bite.
Yeah.
The book shows how conflict and displacement can threaten to erase entire food traditions. What's an example of that made that idea real for you?
I mentioned this in your earlier question, but the genesis of the book was really with my father. And I always wanted to learn his language, Sindhi. Like I said, my father is from Pakistan, and my father had experienced the partition of Pakistan and India. And that violence had lingered within inside him for a long time. And it was very painful for him to transmit his culture down to my brother and sister, but I always had wanted to learn it. And like I said, like he started talking to me as an adult for the first time about his experience with the partition. And I could see how the tentacles of that time reaching down through the years and stealing language from me, stealing our family's culture. Fast forward, I'm in Afghanistan, and I had been working for Human Rights Watch for a couple of years there, investigating human rights abuses. And a dear friend of mine, Tamim, had invited me for dinner. And Tamim is a really special man, a dear friend of mine, who, like many Afghans, had been a refugee many times. His family fled the Soviet invasion. They had lived as refugees in Pakistan, had lived as refugees in Iran, eventually settled in the West. He had come back during the American occupation when Afghanistan was trying to rebuild at that period. And Tamim called me over for dinner, and there was this beautiful meal on the table. And there was this one dish in particular, this beautiful golden chickpea stew is really luscious. And it was tangy from this beautiful garlic yogurt. And I remember I hadn't seen it before. And I remember asking Tamim, is this Afghan? Thinking because he had so many different experiences that maybe this was some sort of amalgamation of his cooking technique, because he's a really wonderful cook, by the way. And that's why. And he said, Michael, it is Afghan. Of course it's Afghan. And the reason why you haven't seen it is because people are forgetting how to make it. The ingredients are hard to find. And we started having this long conversation about food and Afghanistan and the reason why a lot of dishes and why Afghanistan's at war in the first place. And I started to see in that, just think about when you're fleeing a war zone, you're going to take, if you can, if you have time, you're probably going to pack up your most precious things and you take them with you. But Afghans were also taking their cultural knowledge with them. And part of that, when they were fleeing as refugees, were taking their culinary knowledge. And so a lot of this culinary knowledge lives outside of Afghanistan and not necessarily in the country. But Tamim was trying to bring it back in some way. And so I saw in that moment, again, those same tentacles that had reached out through the generations to steal language from me, had that violence was stealing Afghanistan's recipe. And I started to look at that as I went across the world into different conflict zones for my human rights work. And I started to see this in different contexts. I started to ask, how is the violence changing the cuisine? And people just had these really wonderful stories, also tragic stories, but started gifting me recipes to take them out of the war zones, their family recipes, so they would live on. And so that's the genesis of the book, is to show how violence alters our cuisines, but how special our food traditions are to all of us, how it's a language, how older generations can communicate to younger generations, how they're kind of a border, both culturally and sometimes even physically, around our different communities. They're our identity.
One of the things I took away from the book was that preserving this food tradition is almost an act of resistance.
It is not only an act of resistance, it's a defiance in some ways. And that is really one of the most important things I think about what I learned writing this book is, one, how personal a family recipe is to someone, how much it represents not only their family history, but their cultural history, and how when it's lost, how painful it can be. But also the act of keeping it alive, the act of cooking it, to teach their children about what their food looks like, how it tastes, is an act of defiance against a violence that is forcing them into a refugee camp or forcing them into another country. It is, they were attacked by guns, they are fighting back with food. So yeah, it's a real act of defiance.
Your book is part memoir, part oral history, part recipe collection. Similar to your talk today, the book is very vivid with visual language. Why was it important to you to bring all of these elements together, and how do they help tell the bigger story you wanted to share?
It's a different form of writing than I've ever done before. I was used to writing human rights reports, very kind of staid, and policy reports. There are a lot of different goals with this book, right? One of them is that I work some really awesome human rights organizations that do some really good work, but their main audience are policymakers and militaries and warring parties, to get them to stop the abuse or to get people to hold the warring parties to account, right? My goal with this was that the broader public needs to know about these issues and these people, because a lot of these stories, the Uyghurs, the Rohingya, the Quechua in Bolivia, the Elam Tamils, they don't make it on the front page of the New York Times. And so I had these really awesome stories that people shared with me. And part of the goal was to share these stories with the broader public, to talk about their lives, what was happening with them. And one of the ways to do it was through food. So one of the bets that I made with this book is that if you care about food, you might care about the people making it and care about what's happening to them.
On that same line, you chose to put real recipes alongside the narrative in the book.
Yeah.
Why was that important, and how do those recipes help preserve the traditions you write about?
The recipes are crucial to this book. They give you that, I think, that tangible connection to the people that you'll meet in this book. And it's also their recipes. It's the things that they were literally saving. They were risking it all to save. And I want people to cook those recipes. And in fact, those recipes were given to me with the express intention that I do share them and that they are cooked as a means of survival and a means of getting to know these people and to see why they're fighting to keep their culture alive. And I think they're equally as important as any other part of this book.
I think it was great that you included some recipes where the ingredients are very difficult to come by or impossible to come by.
Yeah, I wanted to keep the recipes almost exactly as the way they were given to me, maintain fidelity to the people that had shared them with me. I did work with some professional cookbook writers to make them more accessible but pretty much the method and the ingredients are all the same. And that's why there are some ingredients that are hard to find because that's just what the recipes are. And so it's also an exploration yourself. You have to go out and find them. There is one recipe in the book which will be almost impossible to make. That is the coca leaf tea. And I encourage your audience to read the book to understand why, but I purposely put that in there because you couldn't make it to make a point.
You could travel.
Yeah, you could try. You could travel to Bolivia or the Andes to try it.
So I grew up in Lorraine, which for the past 57 years has held an international festival. In the early years, it was a large fundraiser for local churches and social clubs who made traditional dishes from their home countries. Over the years, it shifted to more food trucks and fewer of the homemade meals that I remember from a kid. From your perspective, can you talk about how food culture naturally evolves in communities as communities change?
That's a really awesome question. And it's important to recognize here that, like, in the last we bite, while I'm talking about cultural preservation, I'm not trying to make an argument around authenticity. I'm not trying to, as an outsider, draw a line around a cuisine and saying this is the authentic cuisine. Almost everyone that you'll meet in this book recognizes that cuisines change. They innovate. One culture's cuisine will reflect another culture's cuisine because they live in proximity to each other. They change, they evolve naturally. My point here is that cuisines should change on a community's terms, not on an invading army's terms. And I think that what you bring up about how diaspora communities, refugee communities, immigrant communities, when they move to a new place, for example, the United States, specifically Lorain County, they'll try to make their own cuisine, right? They will have to innovate because maybe an ingredient is not there, the exact ingredient. And it becomes something new. And so maybe it's something better. Or they take a technique or ingredient from another culture here in Lorain County and make something new out of it. But they're doing it on their terms. And I think it's natural that happens. I see there's a point to being really strict around keeping a certain recipe alive and maintaining it. And there's a lot of learning and value that goes into that and can come from that. And I think also just using that as a baseline to create really new and interesting stuff is great. It makes our culture more interesting. I think that's really important for right now. Right? Immigrants make America's food more interesting. Not only the people who make it, but the people who grow it and the people that deliver it, they are under threat. And again, if you care about food, you got to care about the people who are growing your food, picking your food, cooking your food, delivering your food, and what's happening to them because, like, they're part of our communities and they make our lives more interesting and more diverse and colorful.
Let's switch over and talk a little bit about you.
Sure.
Outside of your human rights work and writing and promoting the book, what are your interests and hobbies and how do they help recharge you?
Cooking is obviously one of my hobbies. I find it really cathartic. One of my friends once said it's where I put my crazy. So yeah, I try to cook a lot in the evenings. It's a nice way to get my mind off the screen a little bit. I also like to experiment with it and try new things. And luckily my wife is pretty patient with me. I cook a new recipe like 5 times in a row to get it right. That's love when your wife doesn't get upset with you about it. I'm a big runner. I swim quite a bit. I like open water swimming. That is one of my more favorite things to do in life. And in the wintertime, snowboarding. But yeah, cooking in form of just athletics and then reading good books.
The book opens about your family story and you've talked about your father's experience in the partition in India and the loss of the Sindhi language. How did exploring other people's stories help you better understand your own identity?
Learning just how common this is and how little it's discussed. I wish I had included a chapter on Cambodia in this book. And I did a lot of research into it and just recently did a trip to Cambodia and was speaking to a variety of Khmer people who had lived through, who had survived the genocide. There's 50-year anniversary this year, actually. And just how similar their tales of survival and persistence were to things that I've heard from Holocaust survivors, that I've heard from people who, like my father, lived through the partition, and sadly, people that I've talked to, a family in Gaza. And so hearing these things, it's very common. And one of the things that I didn't really understand is how much older generations above me, my father in particular, particularly around partition, they have kept bottled up. It's very hard to talk about even years, decades later. And so that's one thing that I have learned in other examples, talking to survivors of boarding schools here in the United States, Native Americans who survived the boarding school era, and the trouble they still have talking about that time. It just doesn't leave you. And I think not only as people who talk to victims of violence for a living, but professionals who have with trauma, I think policymakers, I think need to recognize this, that this violence does linger on and better support needs to be there. And part of that is addressing the cultures of impunity. Like part of catharsis and putting things behind you is making sure that the perpetrators end up in prison. And we don't do that enough. There's a lot of people get away with a lot of stuff around here, and it shouldn't happen. But also the wonderful thing that I see is that people do persist. They fight to resist and defy the violence around them in order to keep their really spectacular cultures alive, not just music and art, but their food and language. And I think it says a lot about who we are, like the things that we really value. And the world spends a lot of money protecting old buildings and old art. And we should. Those are really important forms of culture, but so is our food. And we need to pay better attention to that and support people doing that.
Looking forward, what's next for you?
I'm trying to do a little bit more with this book. One of the things I want to do is see if I can help funnel some support back into the communities in which I was privileged to talk about in this book. I have a couple of other ideas for future books, but I think that all comes down to how well this one sells and if someone will buy a new one. But generally, I want to keep writing about this. I really find it interesting. And I think the more that we can talk about the different aspects of human rights in ways that relate to everyday people and on our terms, and meet people where they are, I think the better we'll be.
For those who are interested in the dishes and culture you chronicle in your book, do you have any restaurant recommendations in the greater Cleveland area?
Oh man, one of my favorite restaurants, period, not just in Cleveland, is Larder down in Cleveland. Great, fantastic Jewish deli. I love Biryani Hut in Westlake. I think they have some spectacular food and really just a good representation of different parts of the subcontinent's cuisine that aren't reflected in many other South Asian restaurants in Cleveland.
Where can listeners learn more about you and pick up a copy of The Last Sweet Bite?
Where people can learn about me is on my Instagram. I'm at Milkshake, at MILKSHAIKH. Milkshake was my nickname growing up. Also Shake, my last name. Or at michaelshake.com. There's a lot there about me and my book and some interesting videos about the book as well and how I made it. And to buy the book, a lot of bookstores. Loganberry Books carries it here in Northeast Ohio. Online, Penguin Random House will take you to your local bookstore, and it'll take you to Amazon, it'll take you to Barnes & Noble, wherever you want. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the LoraineCounty.com Insights Podcast. Each episode, we share conversations with the people shaping life in Lorain County, from business and government to education, nonprofits, healthcare, and entertainment. Be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can also visit LoraineCounty.com to discover local events, volunteer opportunities, and more community resources. If you know someone who's making a difference in Lorain County, send us a note at podcast@LoraineCounty.com. We would love to share their story and insights. Special thanks to our producer, Leah Gerke, and to you for listening. This has been the LoraineCounty.com Insights Podcast. Conversations with the people shaping Lorain County.